Denby pottery. Do you own any Denby pottery?
I do have some Denby pottery.
I remember when I was a kid, my parents had some Denby pottery. I remember, I can't think what it would have been for, but we used it for something. And I remember my parents saying, "No, that's Denby!" And getting really annoyed at us. It was really special for them. I think it was a wedding gift. They had a load of plates and crockery.
Yes.
So Denby is a very old British company.
Yep.
Based in...
Denby.
Denby. Yeah, it's named after the village in Derbyshire.
Yes, okay.
It was founded in 1809.
Okay.
So 217 years old.
Okay.
But as of this week, it is at risk of collapsing because the company has, and I said this to you beforehand, it has filed, what is it called? Applied for?
An application for administration. Yeah.
Which isn't to say it's going into administration, is that right?
My understanding is that means that they know that what they owe is more than what they can pay. And so they have to take the first steps along the road to administration, because you're not allowed to trade as an insolvent business knowingly. Okay.
So they've got a lot of debts and they're worried that they're not going to be able to pay them, essentially.
Yes. Yeah. So money in the bank is less than the things that they owe everybody else. So
Denby's an interesting company because I think it is it represents, or it's symbolic of a lot of the problems with UK business. And we talked about Vassal State, a book by Angus Hanson.
We did.
About how a lot of British businesses are actually American owned. And that was with our conversation with Jacob Reynolds last week.
Indeed.
And Denby, whilst it's a British company, it was bought out by Hilco Capital in 2009, £30 million. Now, Hilco Capital is a private equity firm, which is owned by Hilco Global, which is based in the US. Shock horror. But there's an element to this story around British businesses being foreign owned and how a lot of our industry has been hollowed out.
Yeah.
But also in regards to the problems that manufacturing companies face in the UK, something we talk about a lot in the SDP is energy problems. So in the UK, we have the highest industrial energy prices anywhere in the world. So industrial electricity is around 25 pence per kilowatt hour. Any guesses what it is in China or America?
7 or 8 pence?
Yeah, pretty much. So in China, it's about 6 pence, and in America, it's about 7 pence. Gas in the UK is about 5 times more expensive than in the US.
Okay.
And with an industry like pottery and ceramics, and I'm a novice at this, but a friend of ours here in Manchester has a pottery business and tells us all about it, and I've seen the kilns. These kilns work off gas, the gas-fired kilns.
Yep.
So they're incredibly energy intensive, and it's an industry where energy is a core component. It's not a byproduct. So restaurants, for example, you can find ways to reduce your energy bill and so forth, but it's very hard with something like pottery or ceramics, because that is the only way to reduce your energy bill is to stop doing the thing which you're producing.
Yeah, I'm assuming you can't use a heat pump kind of energy source for firing pottery. So, I mean, it is somewhat ludicrous to expect a company like Denby to be able to compete with companies in China, in America, and we've seen our markets flooded by cheap imports in the last 30, 40 years, and now a historical British-owned or British company is at risk of collapsing, and it's very sad. Very sad, yes. And is there anything that anybody is intending to do about it? Government, for example?
I don't think so. I mean, there's about 500 jobs at risk. So, as we said, Denby is based in Derbyshire, but a lot of to my knowledge from our friend and from the discussions we've had, a lot of the pottery industry is around the Stoke area.
That's right.
Where there's the clay deposits.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I think a lot of that industry is pretty much on its knees. Mm-hmm. And this isn't just Denby. I don't know if the government are going to step in or if there's any plans to save it. Denby themselves have been putting out tweets saying, here's what you can be doing. You can be buying Denby products. You can be signing a petition, and so forth. But so I don't know if there's what's going to happen with it. But I think we have to have a wider conversation about do we just let these things die? Something like a British institution like Denby.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring a plate out because if anybody that uses Denby will know they're pretty much indestructible. The ones my parents had, they'd had them for 30, 40 years, right? And that's one of the problems with their business model is that people don't often replace Denby products because they don't need to, whereas the cheap ones you might get from IKEA and other brands are available. You need replacing a lot more frequently.
Yeah. There's always this tension, isn't there, between saving a business and the kind of idea that I've argued before about there's lots of zombie businesses that we need to let them go. I mean, are there things that Denby should have been doing to make themselves more productive that they haven't been doing? Is there anything that you could say, well, actually, there's a reason we shouldn't rescue this business? I'm just being a devil's advocate to test that thesis.
I don't know, but if you create the conditions that we currently have with energy prices where they are, and a lot of and I don't know if, I'm not an expert in the pottery industry, but a lot of the regulation problems that many industries face in the UK, where it has a lot stricter regulations than other countries, you create those conditions for business, and then you expect them to compete with businesses in other countries. I just don't think that's realistic. And whatever they could be doing differently, they're never going to succeed if they're paying 5 times the price of energy than the US, for example, than China.
Yeah. And government does offer some subsidies to high energy users, doesn't it? It kind of feels like that's something that government should be exploring, because whenever you look at the cost of energy, a big chunk of it is either the extra that they're charging effectively to support the green transition, or it's amounts that are needed to pay for other developments to the infrastructure.
So we discussed this with Jacob Reynolds last week, the idea that he was saying that whilst he wants to be sort of a nationalist when it comes to businesses being British owned, there will be reasons why the American businesses are doing better. And actually, if we end up sort of with a government imposed solution, like saying, well, you must buy British, you're just going to end up with worse goods. And you and I discussed this after the podcast about this idea that you have to do both things. And I worry that too often, especially in our political environment where we're sort of led to believe there's no alternative, too often what the governments are doing, they're just sort of tweaking and they come in at the last second. And you mentioned this with steel.
Yeah.
Right, you could nationalise the steel industry, the stuff that was at risk in Hull. Was it Hull? Up that way. It's not Hull, is it? Scunthorpe.
No, Scunthorpe, yeah.
But then is that not just a different sort of bureaucratic ownership without that democratic overhaul? And I think that's true with something like Denby. It's like this casts light on so many of the problems with industry in the UK, and the fact that so much of our economy is now dependent on services, which isn't great when it comes to the jobs that it's offering people. And you were making the case at a talk last night about people having some sort of sight or perspective on what they've managed to create.
Yeah.
Right. And things like Denby are like real products. I said to you about this, a friend that was showing me her father was working in a factory and he had these brass plates from the factory that she still has. And I held them in my hands and it felt like it was from a different era, which of course it was, but like from a different world. It was just, that sort of thing now is unthinkable. Everything's plastic. I grew up in a plastic world, right? And everything, I remember as a kid, the first, such early memories of toys and looking at the underside of toys and it said made in China. And I remember once having a toy that said made in the UK and I was really confused. I didn't understand because I thought, but we don't do that in this country. As like a really young child, I thought toys came from China, right?
Yeah. See, interestingly, my perspective was very different. So when I was young, people would turn things over and they go, oh, made in China, we're not buying that. Which, because they would think that's going to be going to be shoddily made, cheap, it'll break.
Right.
So they wouldn't my mum and dad would turn something over and if it said made in China, they'd put it down again.
So this story tells us we should be doing things differently when it comes to energy, when it comes to thinking about reindustrialization, something we talk about a lot. But it also tells us that it can't just be a government-imposed solution.
Correct.
Right? And it requires people to be aware of this, to be aware of where things are made and by whom. Right? And this is something that I've been blissfully unaware of for so much of my life. And now as an adult, needing to buy crockery and glasses and things, I'm actually starting to think about, well, where is this made? And is it good quality? Or am I just cheaping out? And I think we've grown, my generation at least, has been spoilt with cheap goods that we think are much better than the alternative. And actually we need to have a better understanding as a consumer of where things are coming from and potentially being more in touch with that. Like now I feel a sudden sense of patriotism towards Denby, a company I've not really thought about much in my life. And I'm thinking, okay, how can we get involved to save this company?
Yes, yeah. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I think the other thing that's a bit different perhaps about your generation is that you're often quite keen to buy things that are old, that are second-hand, that have got a kind of history to them. Whereas for my generation, it was a kind of chuck it out and buy again kind of generation.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. I think seemingly like my friends and peers are much more willing to buy in charity shops than even just 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've always bought clothes from charity shops, and it seems like that's much more in fashion nowadays.
Yeah. But with your generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've got to be really careful when we talk about this, about saying, oh, the whole of one generation is like this and the whole of another generation is like that. And certainly for my generation, for the kind of boomers, I think there's often an assumption that all boomers are rich. And that absolutely is not the case. But there's certainly, a cohort of boomers who are, who have done pretty well and do have quite a lot of disposable income. Obviously, these people have worked all their lives and, they've built up that store of wealth. But it always strikes me when I'm at kind of punk rock gig and you're thinking about the band, because the band are obviously generally very young, certainly for new bands. And I kind of think about them looking at the audience and thinking, oh, got the grannies and granddads in again. And, on one hand, you might think that they think, well, that's not great, we want the young people in. But on the other hand, they probably think, we'll do pretty well on the merch stall today.
Right.
So it's interesting, isn't it, to kind of compare and contrast those things. But I'm just wanting to put in a little, be careful warning that I think often the generational tensions get exaggerated by people jumping to the conclusion that all this generation is that and all that generation is this. I think we should judge people by the content of their character and the content of their wallets, not by kind of stereotypes that we invent.
So I'm wondering if there's a counter-argument to being very pro-Denby. And this is a very new thing for me. This is now my political ideology, would be pro-Denby. When a lot of people might say, what you were talking about, letting zombie companies die, that sort of, what did you call it, creative destruction?
Yes.
Which I think you borrowed from Phil Mullen.
I did, right? The phraseology, yeah.
Why is Denby different?
I mean, that's why I was trying to push you on it earlier. So I think if you posited a company that was perhaps had lots and lots of very old machinery, very old processes, hadn't introduced new technology, hadn't tried to move with ways in which that you can improve productivity, that's the kind of company that I would say is a zombie company. So is there an argument that if you did slash and burn and let Denby go under, could you rebuild Denby 2 on a greenfield site in a much more productive way? And if you can, that's the kind of thing where I think it is actually possible to raise money to finance something like that. And sometimes you do need to let zombie companies die, particularly if they're loaded down with a lot of debt. Now, I don't know this because I've not looked at Denby's books, but when you say they're owned by Hilco, my guess is that Hilco borrowed a load of money to buy that company. And so a lot of the problems that Denby have are because they have a lot of overhang of debt. Now, if Denby Mark 1 dies, that debt dies with it. And then you rebuild Denby 2 without all that debt. Perhaps by, going to the local community or the community in the region and saying, can we find the money to buy a greenfield site and to rebuild? And maybe that's a better solution.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's a good test, right? The creative destruction test, patented by hilary.salt. And I think the answer would probably be in Denby's case that it has such an important history and knowledge that's been passed down, and that history and tradition is actually integral to the company itself and to a lot of its brand, and the people that feel a loyalty to its brand. So I'd say in Denby's case, it probably passes that test. A lot of companies wouldn't. Just on the sort of the protectionist angle of this, because I think in the SDP we're a lot more protectionist than the current establishment, which means that we do think it's important to recognise where we need to give an advantage to British-owned businesses over foreign imports. Now, where that doesn't apply, and I think a lot of people mistake protectionism, is for things where there is a clear comparative advantage for other countries. You take oranges, for example, is the sort of a classic one where it would be preposterous for us to try and create an orange industry to compete with Spain when Spain has such a clear comparative advantage when it comes to its climate, soil, so forth, right? Knowledge, that keen orange farming knowledge, I don't know. And why would we? Because oranges are not a strategic industry which can be used against you when you're vulnerable geopolitically, right? Energy is, however. This is why we need to think about energy independence. And something like the pottery and ceramics, that is an industry, I think, where we look at it and we go, we were a world leader in this.
Yeah.
Right, because a lot of it because of the natural geography of the clay pits, but then because of that, we had the right conditions at the sort of tail end of, if you think of 19th century, where we had an abundance of coal, we had much cheaper energy than we do now comparatively, and so the conditions were right for that industry to thrive.
Yeah.
Now we can create those conditions again. And it's probably worth doing that with something like ceramics and pottery. And maybe this is the traditionalist in me, but I think it's important to keep these industries, an industry like that, which has such a strong history rooted in the place. Yes. I think that's important to maintain.
Yeah. Yeah. But you could maintain it by setting up Denby 2. You could employ exactly the same people. It's just in the field next door.
Okay, if it had the same name and it had the same tradition, lineage. Okay.
Yeah. So I think those are the tests that I would want to, really dig into if you're looking to me to be the, what do they call it, the white knight who goes to rescue a company. That's all the things I would want to test, kick the tyres on.